Welcome to topic 2.2a, our notes on the origins of the Greco-Persian Wars. The goal for these notes is for you to be able to get out of this the ability to explain what caused the war between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states, or at least what led up to it. Now, I'll be filling in those blanks as usual, but when we come back to class, we're going to be doing a simulation, a game where we're going to try to play out the decisions of the Greco-Persian War, and these notes are going to give you clues on the actions, the correct choices to be making in this game so that your team will win. So make sure you're paying attention and bring these notes with you, maybe print them out. So today we're going to actually zoom into history a little bit. A lot of what we've been talking about in this class has been looking at the span of hundreds of years or thousands of years even. But today's lesson, really we're going to look at a 60-year period that's going to be the lead up to the Greco-Persian Wars to give you that context you need. Each of the events on this timeline here is going to be showing up in our coming lessons, so it kind of gives you that reference to what's going on. First key question to answer is, who were the Persians? So a little bit of a refresher. I know we talked about them in Unit 1. We talked to the emergence of empires, but let's do a little bit of a refresher on who they were. So a real quick and oversimplified history of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was started by a man named Cyrus the Great, who united the Iranian tribes sometime around the year 550 BCE. So that's about 2,500 years ago. So they came out of the mountains in this region right here, and they kind of quickly stormed down, and they took over Media and some of the other areas here and incorporated them into this early empire, giving them access to horses, which was a key part of their battle strategy. So within a few years of emerging from the mountains up here, he quickly expanded his control over all of Mesopotamia, even all of Anatolia over here, and even as far east as right into parts of the Indus Valley. His son Cambyses quickly expanded then into Egypt, which was a major win. As we've been talking about, Egypt is a great source of food and gold, but food is kind of the big thing. And then Darius I, who becomes the third emperor of the Persian Empire, you can see kind of this dark purple area you see expanding a little bit further west of Egypt, a little northern in their borders here, and they go right here into the edges of Macedonia, and that's going to be kind of a big thing because that's going to set up this conflict in coming lessons. Hopefully you remember from our lesson on the first empires, Persia ran their government as a complex imperial autocracy. Now that's a very fancy way of simply saying is that they had a very large empire with lots of different cultures, nations, territories, all combined into a single government ruled by one person at the top, the Persian emperor. But to manage this very large and diverse empire, what the emperor did is he divided each section into what he called satraps. Each satrap was essentially ruled by a local governor who then reported up to the emperor, made sure laws were obeyed, made sure taxes were paid, but ultimately left the decision of how to run the local satraps up to the local governors. As part of this, to keep the peace within this really large, diverse empire, he decided that he was going to let the local satraps respect the local cultures, local religions, and customs, and even have some local rule as long as they pledged loyalty to the emperor. Now, when you came into an area, in order to show that you were subservient and controlled by the emperor, all you had to do was give him an offering of dirt and water, the two most important things, saying essentially, this all belongs to the emperor now. If you did that, he allowed some local rule and respect for your religion, your customs, traditions. So there actually was freedom of religion within the Persian Empire. In fact, the Persian Empire banned slavery, unlike the Greeks, as we learned, who their society was rather dependent on slave labor, like a lot of ancient cultures. Religiously, they practice something called Zoroastrianism, and this is a very ancient religion that's still around today. It's not a dominant religion in the world, but it is practiced by many people, like Freddie Mercury, the former lead singer of the band Queen, before he passed away. Now, Zoroastrianism is this belief in an eternal struggle between good and evil. In the Zoroastrian faith, there were two main deities, Ahura Mazda, who was the god of light and creation, and Enlil Manu, the god of destruction and darkness. Now, my pronunciation is terrible. I probably slaughtered that. I do apologize to anyone who practices Zoroastrianism today. It is a very fascinating religion that I spent a bit of time reading up on a couple summers ago. Now, as part of this internal battle between good and evil, the Zoroastrians believe that not just our actions, but even our thoughts play a role in this battle. So the more good actions you do and the more good thoughts you have, the stronger you make Ahura Mazda. But the more evil or bad thoughts you have and actions you do, the stronger you make Enlil Manu. And this is important, right? So it's not just our actions that matter, but it's our thoughts that matter because we are part of this eternal battle between these deities. Now, Cyrus the Great was a practitioner of Zoroastrianism, and he believed that as he was creating this massive empire, what he was actually doing was uniting the world under Ahura Mazda, the god of light and creation. You can see here the fire temple. Zoroastrians sometimes get this reputation as being fire worshippers, but that's actually not true. Fire is just a way of purifying things in their faith. Now, again, this is interesting because he's trying to unite the world under the god of light and creation, but at the same time, he creates an empire that respects the local religions of other people who are not Zoroastrian, showing you can be, as a leader, have a strong religious belief in your duty, but at the same time, allow that religious diversity within the government that you control. So militarily, this is going to be really important, right? So their motivations religiously, that's going to be important for our simulation we're going to do in class, but their military tactics are also going to be important because you're going to have to learn how to counter these tactics. So their army was really the key to their success. They had this innovating new way of combat. So traditionally in the ancient world, the way you would fight is you would have your infantry, your foot soldiers, run up against the infantry, the foot soldiers of the opposing army, and essentially it would be one big clash. The more people you had, or the braver your guys were, generally you'd come out ahead, and that's how you won these battles. The Persians added a twist to this by adding their cavalry, right? They became expert horseback riders, and so what they would do is they would still have their infantry fighting the other infantry, but then the Persian cavalry would come in from either side, and they'd flank it, and they would just crush. And so you see these three-pronged attack straight into the enemy army, and this way that the enemy's front lines would collapse, it would envelop the other side. This was an unbeatable strategy on the open plains of the Middle East, as well as the open plains of Anatolia. But remember, Greece is a very mountainous area, does not have a lot of flat land. So like most ancient armies, they had drafted commoners, so farmers, regular people who are members of the empire. Part of the way they paid their taxes is they did military service when called up by the emperor. And the Persians did this as well, so they had a mix of commoners who were soldiers who were drafted into combat. But another innovation was they had this force called the Immortals, who were a professional army. So those soldiers were full-time. As far as armor and weapons goes, their drafted archers carried generally weaker bows, you can see here. So these bows could only really penetrate light armor if they fired at shorter range, but from a distance, they really weren't going to do too much damage if you were wearing heavier armor. The drafted foot soldiers also had little to no light armor, carried wooden shields at best. But the Immortals, now these professional soldiers, this was a force of 10,000 strong, and they always had 10,000 soldiers. If some died, they were replaced with new ones. If some retired, they were replaced with new ones, but the idea was it's always 10,000. Part of this was because they would also have their faces covered by a thin see-through cloth, a protective gear known as a tiara, that they could see through, but no one else could see their face from the other side, making it look like they were this supernatural being at times when they go into combat. Added to this, they were trained to march in silence, so they're faceless, voiceless as they're marching toward you. They're always 10,000, and because you don't know what their face looks like, it seems like it's always the same 10,000, even though it's not the same people every time. They wore a thin scaled armor, so each sheet of these scales was about as thick as a playing card, and they carried these shields that were made of wicker, basically wood. And these Immortals were really the elite super soldiers of the Persian army. As they expanded, they also needed to be able to fight at sea, so they built a navy using a type of ship known as a trireme, as you can see here, which was designed for speed and ramming. It relied on professionally trained rowers at the bottom levels to get them up to that proper ramming speed. This type of ship was very common. It was not invented by the Persians. In fact, it was invented by our old friends, the Phoenicians, when they were using it for sailing, but they also needed to protect themselves. Now, of course, Persians adopted it and made some improvements to it, but this was basically the main force of the Persian Navy. All right, let's take a look at what type of military the Greeks had. Remember, they didn't have one united army because each of these city-states were constantly at war with each other. They were separate, independent city-states, not a unified empire, so each city trained their own soldiers, had their own kind of combat preferences, but there was some commonalities amongst their armies. Now, most Greek city-states trained what were called hoplites, named after the hoplon shield, which you see right here. The hoplon was a large shield made of wood, but also covered in a layer of bronze, our old friend, the bronze technology. It also had a couple other innovations. So it had a handle here that you could use, but in the center was a leather strap that would hold it closer to your arm, so you could use it as a more maneuverable weapon and for better protection than if it just had a single handhold. Now, this shield was so big it weighed up to 15 pounds, and Greek soldiers were known for decorating it in whatever style they wanted. Their main weapon actually wasn't a sword, it was a spear known as the dory. It was a 7 to 9 foot long spear that had an iron tip for stabbing. Remember, we're in the Iron Age. So at the tip here, you'd see a very sharp, pointy iron edge, but on the back side for balance, they actually had an iron ball there as well that they could also use for bludgeoning, for beating people. So they could stab you with it or whip it around and hit you with the back and crack your skull open. This spear would typically weigh between 2 and 4 pounds, and it was the preferred weapon of hoplites and Greek soldiers. Now, if their spear broke or they lost it or something happened, or they were in too close combat, they couldn't use the spear, that's when they switched to what was called the Xiphos sword. This was a backup weapon. It was only about 2 feet long. It was made of iron as well. And again, it was only used if the spear is broken. This sword would weigh about 1 to 2 pounds. So you can see right here, they're already wearing about 20 pounds of gear, and we haven't even talked about their armor yet. Speaking of their armor, they also had leather or bronze chest plates right here covering their abdomens and their other hearts, their important vital organs. This would be another 8 to 15 pounds depending on the size and what's made of. They'd have greaves that would cover their legs, designed basically to cover the areas below where the shield would, and a Corinthian helmet that's lined in leather for comfort, but also covered in bronze. So we see our old friend, the bronze technology here. Now, it was designed to limit your sight so you could see only what was in front of you to keep you focused on your enemy in the combat. And up here, you'd see these plumes, these feathers essentially, that would be designed to signify your rank. Hoplites fought in what was known as a phalanx formation. This was essentially looked just like this from the movie 300, you might remember it. And the idea was the front line used their large hopline shields to overlap to provide some protection for their neighbor, and they would have 8 or more soldiers behind them that would then brace the front line so that when the enemy armies came crashing into them, the line wouldn't budge and they would hold still. When the enemy armies tired themselves out and had to push back, then the hoplites would be able to stab from the front as well as the people behind would be stabbing down, creating kind of this wall of death and destruction of anyone in front of them. The soldiers behind it said that the second line would be stabbing down, and the ones further back would be there to support for strength, but at the same time, in case someone fell in battle, they would be able to move up in line and keep the strength of this formation. This was an intense and extremely powerful strategy for winning in close combat, but it relied on the fact that it was only as strong as the weakest person on the front line, so it required intense commitment, training, strength, and bravery of every single person on the line. Now, you'll know from previous lessons, the Greeks were great seafarers, and just like the Persians, they adopted the trireme warships used by the Phoenicians. So essentially, you had at sea, they're pretty much equal technologically speaking, right? And the idea here is you get your trireme and you try to row it as close to the other ship as possible, and you break their oars, making it so that they could no longer attack you, or you'd ram it, see if you get to this perpendicular way, you'd ram it and break it in half, and that's how you disable the other ships. Alright, final question. Who are the Ionians, and what did they do? So Ionia is right here. It's on the western edge of the Anatolian Peninsula, an area that we've been looking at since the beginning of this course. So you'll notice it's right on the edge of both the Greek world, but also the edge of the Persian Empire. So this is going to be a kind of a flashpoint of conflict that's going to start this war. A very, very short overview of Ionian history. It was originally colonized by Greeks, mainly Athens and several other Greek city-states, about 500 years before this moment, so about 1000 to 900 BCE, so that's about 3,000 years ago. The Greeks start kind of sailing over and settling in Ionia, right here on the western edge of Anatolia. If you're keeping track, this would have been after the Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age collapse, so the Greeks were colonizing Ionia way back in the Greek Dark Ages, but 500 years after those cities were colonized by the Greeks, mainly Athens and a couple others, it was conquered by Cyrus the Great in 546 BCE, but again, the satrap model of the Persian Empire was allowing for localized rule, respecting of local gods, local traditions, things like that. This brings us to the flashpoint, the Ionian Revolt. So in 499 BCE, the Greek Ionian city-states over here were kind of upset with the local rulers. They called them tyrants, said they weren't respecting the people enough. And so the Ionian city-states that have this Greek heritage, many of which are Athenian in ancestry, decided they're going to rise up in a revolt, and they're going to ask Athens for help, thus starting this conflict between the Persians and the Greeks. And this is what we're going to pick up in our next lesson as we do a simulation on the Greco-Persian Wars. As I said, there's a lot of hints to what you should be doing in this war if you were paying attention in the notes here. But for now, do as we always do, rewrite today's goal at the bottom of the note sheet here in red, identify those 3 important facts from the notes that help you understand that goal, and then write one question you still have showing that intellectual curiosity. All right, See you next time in class, and we'll get this war started.